This is a pretty nice epoxy resin coffee table with a beautiful piece of walnut wood floating right in the middle. Now, I can't say this was easy or perfect for that matter, but fortunately for you, you get to watch a great video where I make all the mistakes so you don't have to. Now, you may or may not ever make a project like this one, but whether you're a beginner or you have a lot of epoxy experience, I think you just might learn a few things. Welcome to Allie Picked. In my Epoxy for Beginners Part 1 video, I didn't talk a lot about safety when it came to working with epoxy resins, but it is an important topic, so I do want to start off this video with a few safety tips.
Next thing you know, your gas light goes out on your new gas range. You just happen to be holding a match.
Hey! You're not gonna like that, are you?
Don't worry, folks. I'm a fire marshal.
When you find an epoxy that you want to use, look on their website for an SDS or safety data sheet, like this one from Let's Resin.
It's boring. You're boring, everybody.
I couldn't find this on their website, so I emailed them and then they sent this to me. This document will tell you if there are any health hazards, its chemical composition, and recommended protective gear. For this product, you do need adequate ventilation. You don't need a respirator, but it's your choice if you want to be extra careful. I can tell you that working with this product, I didn't smell any foul odors. Well, except the ones coming from me, but that's a whole nother story. It does recommend eye protection, chemical resistant gloves, and if you do get some on your hand, you can clean it with isopropyl alcohol. I've also used ethyl alcohol, and you're supposed to be able to use hand sanitizer. But get the SDS, read it, become familiar with it, because all epoxies are different. Now, let's resin. The key to making this table is to use a kit like this one from a company called Let's Resin. This kit is about 45 bucks on Amazon. It comes with a mold, a support band for around the mold, and 3 foldable support legs. You'll also need to buy a gallon of epoxy resin. That'll set you back another 70 bucks. It's not all that expensive, but in the end, you'll end up with a beautiful table and a new skill. I had this beautiful 3/4 inch walnut board I purchased at a garage sale a couple of years ago, and I knew I'd find a use for it someday. Even though it's flawed, that's what makes this piece of walnut so attractive to me. There's a lot of prep that I need to do to the wood before it can be usable to put into the epoxy. You might be wondering why I'm removing all of the bark. That's one of the best characteristics about the wood. Well, there are a couple of problems with the bark. First of all, it's easy for a loose piece of bark to come off and float around in your epoxy. Even worse than a loose piece of bark are bubbles. With this bark, there's a high likelihood that bubbles are going to get trapped in and around the bark. It's possible to seal all of the wood and the bark, but I'm just trying to avoid problems, so I'll take it off. I clean the wood with some paint thinner. This also lets me know if I missed any scratches that need more sanding. The most important part of this process, if you're going to introduce wood into the epoxy, is to seal it thoroughly. I'm applying a generous coat of shellac sanding sealer. But this is where I make my first big mistake, which I don't find out about until later. When the shellac is dry, I give it a test fit into the mold. To calculate the amount of resin that I'm going to need with the wood, I fill the mold with the wood in it with water, and then I drain it out into a bucket and measure it. Since this epoxy has been stored in my chilly basement, I'll warm it up in warm water. It should be between 75 and 85 degrees. This is the epoxy I'm using. There's one thing I don't like about this epoxy, and I'm not sure if it's the same for other brands. The instructions here say to mix no more than 8 ounces in one container at a time. Otherwise, you risk the product flash curing prematurely. Part of me wanted to take the risk and mix it all at once, but since this is about $50 worth of epoxy, I thought I should follow the instructions. I didn't find any mention of this band in the instructions, but it made sense to keep it snugly around the mold to keep the epoxy from pushing outward on the walls of the mold. My plan is to make this table in 3 separate pourings. Step 1, fill it about halfway with the wood in place. My fear is that if I fill the whole mold all the way to the top, this might cause the wood to float. Now, I didn't think that was likely, but I'm taking no chances. After using a heat gun to pop the bubbles and a needle to pick out any floaters, I close the lid to keep out any more dust. I'll check on this a couple more times over the next 30 minutes or so to see if any more bubbles need popping. The next day, the epoxy is dry to the touch. Now I need to prepare for the second pour by sanding the epoxy with some 220 or 300 grit paper. This is so that the next layer will have something to bite into. After sanding and cleaning it thoroughly, you might think that you're going to see the sandpaper scratches on the next pour, but you don't. They're invisible. The first pour was about 1/4 inch thick, just to hold the wood in place. The second pour will be even with the top of the wood. This time I decided to take a chance and mix all 32 ounces together. It worked out fine, no flash curing. Same process as before. I'll check up on it for bubbles over the next 30 minutes and then come back tomorrow. The next day, everything looks great. I sand and clean the epoxy again. Now I need to figure out the spacing for the 3 legs. To do this, I Googled how to divide a circle in 3 sections, and I made this template. I've seen other people make this table, and they screwed the legs into the epoxy. Now, I don't like that idea. I think doing it this way is going to be much stronger. When doing it this way, I do need to be careful. The epoxy needs to go over the brackets, but not so high that it blocks the holes that the legs are going to fit into. This is where I start to experiment. I decide to add some blue ink rather than leave the table clear. I bought a set of resin inks at the hobby store. At this point, I don't think it's too bad, but it's not great either. I decided to add some white. After drying overnight, here's how it came out. Now I can take it out of the mold. The bottom of the mold is going to be the top of my table, and this is where my 4th pour will come into play. I just took the cured resin out of the mold, which is always exciting, but there are some issues I have to deal with. The first concern, I need to sand down this surface, which is the top side of the table. Right now, the wood is exposed. I want to smooth and even this top surface. And after I flatten it out completely, I'm going to apply a coat of tabletop epoxy. The second issue that I have, which is common to when you're using a mold, is at the very top, the part that touches the mold, it tends to climb slightly, resulting in a slight curve upward, and it creates this sharp edge. And it's sharp enough to cut your skin, so I'm going to need to sand that all the way around. The third issue I have is when using a silicone mold, they're not rigid. Even though I had that plastic band that ran all the way around, in a couple of places on the edges, they're not perfectly round. So I'm going to have to see if I can fix that with some sanding. When pouring epoxy in layers like I did here, if you look at the edge, you can actually see the separate layers. It's hardly noticeable, but it is there. The last problem I have to deal with, it's not really a problem, I really didn't have a choice, but it's the positioning of the brackets. I was able to hide 2 of the brackets behind the wood, but this one here, it's sticking out just a little. It would be nice if I had maybe some dye to cover it. I'll see what I can do about that when I apply the top coat. I may end up just leaving it as is. One other comment I'll make about the table, and that's when using inks like this. When you swirl the inks, rather than mixing them thoroughly in the epoxy, what happens is, you can see it here, they get pulled towards the center. Now, when I first laid down these swirls, I had them all the way to the edge, and by morning, they had moved over an inch towards the center. Now, I know of no way to stop this phenomenon. It doesn't look bad, it's just something you need to be aware of. For sanding the top before my final pour, I'll start off with 100 grit and work my way up to about 400 grit sandpaper. If you notice what I'm doing here, I'm pouring the epoxy on the wood right after I sanded it. I forgot to seal the wood.
What are you, an idiot?
After I leveled it off, I had so many bubbles that wouldn't quit. I ended up scraping off all the wet epoxy, letting it dry, resanded, Then I sealed the wood with a coat of sanding sealer. Well, I thought that would take care of that, but after I poured the tabletop epoxy a second time, there were fewer bubbles, but there were 2 bubbles in particular that wouldn't stop. I used the heat gun to pop them, but they came back almost immediately. Guess what? I scraped it off all again, let it dry, sanded it again. This time, I sealed it with 3 coats of polyurethane. Finally, no bubbles. For leveling the epoxy, you can use a plastic scraper, but I found this small tooth trowel which worked great. Let the epoxy run over the edge. Then I wipe all the way around with a gloved finger. It'll continue to drip, so you're going to need to scrape off the bottom edge when it starts to set up. If you forget to scrape the bottom, it's going to get rock hard, and then it'll be very difficult to remove. Here's something I never tried before, but it seemed to work out well. I put painter's tape on the bottom edge. After the epoxy hardened overnight, I removed the tape. It was a little difficult to remove, but at least the epoxy drips didn't ruin the underside of my table. To cover up this black bracket showing through the bottom, I'll add some white and blue pigment inks to help cover it up. I'm very glad that I made this table in layers rather than in one single pour. If I had gotten bubbles that wouldn't quit in one single pour, I would have been stuck with the way it turned out. The next day, I removed the painter's tape, and I'm very happy with the way that this table turned out. I hope you were able to follow along with this video. I know it got a little complicated with all the separate pours and on top of that all the mistakes I made along the way. But as I said before, you will make mistakes. The key takeaways in this video are 1. Mix your epoxy thoroughly. 2. Environment is vital. Dust, temperature, and ventilation are very important. 3. Know your product. Read the instructions thoroughly that came with your epoxy. Now, if you haven't seen part 1 of this video, I'll have a link to that up here. Now, before you go, I want to show you one other tabletop that I made using the same mold. Check this out. Isn't that cool? It looks like a piece of stained glass. There's no wood embedded in here. It's just 100% epoxy with some inks added. Now, don't forget to subscribe to Alley Picked. And until next time, I'll meet you in the alley.